to. Um, so, so an out-of-context problem, we need to pull that into our context. And when we encounter an out-of-context problem, we're typically fearful, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's typically accidental. It's typically something that is so surprising. Our response typically is inadequate for the situation. However, when we pull things into our context, we're prepared, we're confident, we have the adequate resources, right? Here is a big example of this out-of-context problem being pulled into our context. 9/11, the Twin Towers. For Americans, and for the American public in general, I'm not sure about the military, but the American public in general, that was an out-of-context problem. We never imagined that people would fly planes with human beings and use them as missiles to take down buildings. That was outside of our context. Will 9/11 ever happen again the way it happened the first time?
Probably not.
Probably
How
not.
the lesson gets learned, it's hard to say.
Right? So probably not exactly the way it happened the first time, because now it's in our context.
We can imagine it now.
We can imagine it now. Not only can we imagine that, there are other things that we now have in our imagination that we never would have thought before, right? And so now, people are thinking of strategies that they hadn't thought of prior to that particular incident.
Just a little personal example.
Yeah.
I was shaving with the radio on 9/11, and I heard this news break that a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers. My limited imagination said that was a single-engine Piper Cub that got off course and hit the building and fell to the ground.
Yep.
That was all I could imagine.
Yeah. I was teaching high school at the time. And I felt really sad for my kids because I knew on that day the world had changed for them.
Absolutely.
And we watched the second plane hit as we're sitting in the classroom. And I'm like, and kids are just so confused. They were like, what's happening? I don't understand what's going on. What? And, we really had to take some time to break that down for them and make meaning. And everything that I feared has actually come to pass in terms of how the world has changed. So, and so when we get to understanding that people are coming from a context and they're trying to put things in context, then we're not so xenophobic, right? So I'm not so afraid of the others because I know what they're going after, even if I don't understand their methods. And so if I understand that these three things are driving their behavior, or they're trying to achieve these three things, then we can have some discussions about their methods. It's when I question their values or their morals or their, why they're doing that, that's when it becomes difficult to be helpful or to overcome some of those cultural gaps. Do these models make sense?
They do. Andre, I'm kind of coming up against from the other side the implication that everybody's values are as good as everybody else's. So that gets into the issue of contextual ethics. And I think we don't want to say, because it's unfamiliar to me, it's unfamiliar. I think we need a place to say some rituals, patterns, child sacrifice is not okay.
Correct. But that also comes within the discussion of the context from which we're in.
Of course, but there's an edge there. So let me see if I can come at it this way. What you're talking to us about is prejudice, bias, respect, mutual respect, those kinds of lovely values.
What I'm not
But there's
talking
an
about...
edge someplace in there where we can't say all values are the same.
Right. And what I'm not talking about are human sacrifices.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about genitalia mutilation.
Right.
I'm not talking about those things that are hurtful to individuals that particularly we have said as a whole are some things that we value. We value human life.
Yeah.
And so what that means is, yeah, so, yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I'm really talking about those things that help to build our human family, not necessarily exercise the ability to do and conduct evil. And one of the things, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I've also been really trying to work on some of these concepts to get exactly to the other side of this conversation about these things, right? And so one of the things that I've come to understand, I do have another piece, is that the body and the spirit, when connected, create a soul, right? And the background that I use for this particular model comes from Judeo-Christian ideals, right? So when God created man and woman, he created them. So he created man and woman, and then he created Adam a body out of the dust of the earth, and then he breathed the breath of life. And Adam became a living soul, right? And so what I'm talking about are all those things that help keep the body and the spirit connected to each other so that they continue to be a whole soul, right? What typically happens is that evil in the way that I like to express this concept of evil, its job is to separate the body and the spirit, which produces this void. Right? So once the body and the spirit are separated, the body then becomes a thing. How do we treat things? How do we treat things? How do you treat a hammer?
Use it without any regard for its own identity.
Yeah. You pick up a hammer, you see a nail, boom. You know what, and if you want to slide the hammer across the floor, you just slide it. There's no real regard for the effects of, how you use that hammer. To the hammer, it is a tool to be used. It is a thing, right? When evil separates the body and the spirit, and the body becomes a thing, then we have strip clubs.
It's interesting, just this afternoon I was talking with one of my students, and she was talking about the tension in her growing up family when her father wanted to take her to Hooters. And she had all these reactions to that, and he kept dismissing her concerns. So I pressed her. She said it made me feel awful or whatever, and I kept pressing her until she got to the objectification part of that. And I shared with her it's not mine, but I got it from a friend of mine, best definition of sin is treating people like things and things like people.
That's right. That's a great way, right?
And it's such a simple understanding. When we have more reverence and affection for automobiles than we do for our family members.
Yeah.
Or treating, women like objects, tools.
Yeah. And so when we are able to separate, the body becomes a thing. And so we treat women and we treat children and we treat each other any way we treat the enemy, any way that we want to, because this enemy doesn't have a spirit.
Doesn't have a spirit.
It's not a soul, so we will do whatever we want with it, right? And
All American wars have been holy wars,
all of them.
in which the Jap and the Jerry and the Gook are inhuman.
That's right. And we do this for God and country,
Yeah.
right? The spirit then becomes power less,
Mhm.
right? Many of us have gone to funerals, and however we do that piece, I know is different, but in my family and in my religious traditions, we usually have an open casket, and so you go and you see the person. But whenever I go there, the person's not there, right? Because the animating power of who they are, their spirit, is no longer in that body, right? And so the spirit still has power, but it has less power because it's not connected to a body, right? Her memory, my grandmother's memory, is still very powerful to me, but it's less powerful now than when it was in her body, right? And so what typically happens when evil, or another way to kind of talk about this, is this concept of a hegemony, which is a system created to benefit, to help the creator benefit from the system itself, right? And so evil, I believe, is the separation of the spirit and the body, and hegemony is the tool oftentimes used to create systems that separate these two, to create this void. Now, what we oftentimes don't talk about is the fact that what this void creates is something that we don't talk about. That because I don't feel adequate, I will buy things, I will gain things, I will achieve for things to fill this void. Cars, money, houses, sex, makeup, right? Alcohol, drugs. I'll do all of these things to fill this void because every time my spirit, I need the two together so that I can be whole. But if the hegemony or the free market can convince me to keep this void open, then they can sell me my completeness. They can sell me on the fact that blah, 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 blah. All of those things are true. And so part of our journey as helpers is to try to keep the body and the spirit as closely tied together.
It's funny because Madison Avenue, meaning the advertising industry, has a very simple message, and that is happiness is only $1,000 away and can be had on credit. And if you're unhappy, it's because you're not consuming properly.
That's right.
And the secret is to consume that more, better, my product, rather than the other product, and you'll be happy. So particularly TV advertising is essentially advertising drugs. It's mood altering. All the products that are, it's how you will feel wearing Hanes underwear and driving your new Chevrolet. It's how you will feel. It's not the utilitarian value or the benefit to the community or anything. It's how it will make it a drug. And that's, I think, what I'm hearing with the free market void.
Our cars and houses and money and drugs used appropriately, or sex or makeup, are those things bad in and of themselves? No, right? But nothing will ever be able to fill this void. And so, yeah, I can have cars. But what happens if the car crashes and it's a part of my identity? Then all of a sudden, I'm losing it, right? I'm like, no, that's my identity, that's who I am. I park in 2 parking spaces so nobody scratches my car, right? Because I have a void. And so no matter how much stuff we put in, it never allows us to feel completed.
There's an expression, you can never get enough of what you really didn't want in the first place.
That's right. With money you didn't have. Right. To impress people you don't know. Right? So, no, so cars and money, those things are great in perspective, right? So part of what and actually the body and the spirit should look like this. That's what it really should look like, right? But for the sake of my example, I did the Venn diagram. But, and so when we're able to get people to those places, that's when we can really help them be effective in being the drivers of their lives.
Part of what I'm hearing, Andre, is the current emphasis on mindfulness in the psychological and social science fields. There's so much talk about mindfulness, which is being in the now and being aware of your body, your spirit, and not being in the future. And it feels like that's kind of implied in a lot of what we've been talking about.
Yeah. I am a self-subscribed student of Parker Palmer. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Parker
I
Palmer.
sure am.
Please get his stuff if you have the opportunity. I was introduced to him through one of his first books. I'm not sure if it's the first, but Courage to Teach. And I was a young guy, and was given that as a gift and started really reaching that. And he has Hidden Wholeness is another one of his books. But he speaks a lot about how to engage the soul, right? I mean, because once we get that split, then all sorts of things and all sorts of behaviors come out of that. And so, yeah, so when we talk about those negative aspects of this safety, significance, and belonging, the card that I typically use is that behavior uniting the body and the spirit, or is it dividing the body and the spirit? And if it's dividing the body and the spirit, it is evil. And so when we talk about human mutilations, we talk about all that child, pornography, or sexual, impropriety with, human trafficking, all that kind of stuff. This is my litmus test. Is that behavior uniting the body and the spirit? If not, it is evil.
It's a very simple but useful construct.
I'm trying to be like Adler.
I keep thinking of a poster that one of my colleagues had back in the mid-70s. The poster said, "I am in some ways like all other human beings, and I am in some ways like certain other human beings, and I am in some ways like no other human being."
That's right.
There's an interesting way in which we are unique, but we're also part of a larger community.
Yeah. I found it very interesting that there's an entertainer, I'll call him, named Darren Brown, and he's in Great Britain. He does a lot of, he uses psychological experiments in his performances, and he does a lot of kind of group art kind of stuff using a lot of psychological experiences. And so to better understand some of his stuff, I've researched a number of the things he presents that I obviously didn't get taught in school, right? And so I researched this stuff and become a student. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting is that he came to, this guy, I think his last name is Garrison, and he came up with the concept of kind of group think. And he does this experiment where he takes a jar of jelly beans, and he asks people to just, with their eye shot, write down a number of how many jelly beans they think is in the jar. And so he has one individual, so he asks the whole group, and they all go and they tally all of their answers. They come up with the mean, and then he picks, one person gets the closest, so he pulls them out and he asks them how they blah, 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 and they either got it right on or pretty close. But then he pulls the group's mean and finds out that the group actually is accurate. They have exactly the number that's in the jar. And so for me, what that says is that together we're much more accurate in making decisions than we are as individuals. However, that process is not always adequate for the timing that things need to happen. So those were some of the observations that I've made. So I wanted to give you these pieces as a part of our conversation. And next time I think I'm going to bring some water and juice and snacks, because this just feels like we need snacks.
Andre,
So,
I
yeah.
overheard, I was listening to a conversation on Bill Moyer's program a few weeks back, and he was talking